Hey YouTube, I am underneath a 2000 Nissan Frontier Crew Cab XE four-wheel drive. Camera's facing towards the front of the truck. This drive shaft is the rear shaft, and that's going towards the rear axle. And as you can see here, we've got the center support bearing in the viewfinder here. Anyway, the complaint that the customer had with this truck is when she is accelerating, she can feel a vibration underneath, through the floorboards. Pretty low frequency rumbling type of vibration. Seems to get worse when there's weight in the back. So if there's people in the back seat or if she's got some cargo in the bed, the rumbling seems to get worse. I'm gonna shake this drive shaft here, and as you can see, as you will see, you'll see this center support bearing is just completely trashed. It is not supporting the drive shaft. So what happens here is this rubber wears out over time. This truck's 20 years old and spent all of its life in Alaska. So this rubber is definitely perished. It's dead. And it's not supporting the drive shaft. So what happens is the drive shaft gets out of whack as far as its angles are concerned, and you feel that low frequency vibration. Pretty easy job to do this, so I will get some protective equipment on. As you can see here, I'm spinning the drive shaft. I've got the rear end of the truck jacked up and supported on jack stands. That helps a lot, and the truck is currently in neutral. Not a hard job at all, just a matter of removing a few bolts. And as soon as I get some gloves on and some tools out, we'll proceed. Okay, so once we have the vehicle jacked up in the air, vehicle in neutral, we'll go ahead and grab a paint marker. And what we need to do is we need to mark the shaft in relation to where it is on the yoke. All of this stuff is a balanced assembly, so it's recommended by Nissan to mark everything. So we will put a mark on the drive shaft, just so we know, and mark the yoke right here too. Put a mark on everything here, just so we know that everything's going to be aligned once we put everything back together. So the next step is we're gonna align the shaft here so that I can get to all four bolts. I'll put the vehicle back in park and remove these four bolts that hold the rear section of the rear drive shaft onto the yoke here. Okay, something I will note, you definitely want to use a 6-point tool of some sort with these little bolts. Especially if you're in the Rust Belt like we are here in Alaska. Anyway, you don't want to round off these bolts. It's not very fun when you use a 12-point tool and the bolt heads here round off. So definitely use 6-point tools when available. So what I'll do is I'll just loosen all four of these. There's 2 on this side and 2 on the other strap. You probably can't see the other 2, but you get the idea here. Whoops. So I'll get to working on these, and we'll turn the camera back on once I've got these pretty much out. Okay, in case I forgot to mention it before, the bolt heads for these U-joint straps are a 6mm, they take an 8mm head. So I've got all 4 of those removed for now. This rear section of the drive shaft is a fixed piece, so there is no slip yoke here. So the next thing we have to do is remove the bolts holding down the center bearing. And these take a 17mm. A flex handle ratchet like this will help. If you're in the Rust Belt, go ahead and spray it with something like Aerocroil, like I did. Usually these are a bugger to get off. So we'll go ahead and do that. Let's see if this side I gotta say, this is going a lot smoother than it usually does. Anyway, we'll get this loosened. I might as well just leave the camera rolling. Hopefully I'm not in the way. But as you can see, the flex head really helps here. It's one of my favorite ratchets. This one's a snap-on. I tend to use flex heads more than the fixed heads just because of their versatility. Maybe I can do some camera magic here so we can fast forward to this. Me struggling to work around the camera. So that's the two 16mm bolts, or 17. Gosh, maybe I need to go back to bed. Friday night, wrenching. Anyway, 17mm bolts, remove those, get them out of the way for now. So next order of business is we'll move this center bearing. The front half of the dry shaft that goes into the transfer case is on a slip yoke, so we can push this whole assembly forward slightly and remove the rear dry shaft from the yoke, which then we will support with a bungee cord or something along those lines. Okay, let's see if I can get this on camera here. So the vehicle's still in park. Use a pry bar to loosen the U-joint from the yoke. Sometimes they take a little bit of convincing to come out, particularly if they're crusty like things tend to be in Alaska. So from here, we'll hold the dry shaft out of the way. And I'm doing this on my back as opposed to the pit, just to show that, you know, those of you who don't own shops can do this in the driveway. Again, just remember safety first. We have everything on jack stands, the wheels are chalked, on flat ground. This is not going anywhere. So, next order of business is, again, we have to mark the Yokes relationship to the front dry shaft here. This is a crucial step. If this yoke is out of phase with the front yoke on the dry shaft, you will feel severe dry shaft vibrations and you'll kill your U-joints in a heartbeat. So very important, mark the yoke, mark the center shaft of the front dry shaft here. You want to get this right. So I'm just lining it up with our existing mark that we made for the rear dry shaft, or the rear half of the dry shaft. Just, again, we do not want this to get out of phase. All right, so from here, I'm gonna get a better paint marker, but from here we will loosen this nut and I will get you a size very shortly. Hopefully we can get this off. Okay, so once we're got everything marked so that we can return all this stuff to its original location, we'll want to loosen this nut here. This is a 24mm. Leave it in park if you're using manual hand tools. Sometimes it even helps to put these center support bolts back in. But I'm lucky here. I've got, you know, I'm in my shop, so we're using impact guns. So use some ear protection here. It's gonna get loud. So the impact gun makes very quick work of this. So if we're lucky, this yoke will just come right off now, which it should. And of course, because I'm doing it on video, it's not. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put these bolts back in for the center support bearing, just so that things aren't wiggling around as much. Just thread them in a few turns. It doesn't have to go in all the way. So I'll get myself resituated here, and we'll turn the camera back on when I'm ready for you. Okay, well, things don't always go as planned in the YouTube universe, as you might know. So anyway, I've got a two-jaw puller here. I'm gonna work on pulling this dry shaft yoke off. Usually when I've done these, they just fall right off, but this one's being a little bit stubborn. So in an effort to show that sometimes things don't work well in the salt belt, what I did here is I sprayed a little bit of Aerocoil in the middle here where the splines are, and I'm just using a two-jaw puller to pull this guy off. And she's moving. But I don't like using power tools on these pullers. I like to be able to feel what's going on. And certainly you do not want to be hitting the end of the threaded area here with a hammer. These are rather fragile. You'll damage them. And then you won't be able to get the nut back on, and you'll be buying a new dry shaft. Anyway, this puller is slowly doing its job. Maybe we can, yep, we can pull it the rest of the way off. I just want to make sure my mark's still there. So definitely, again, this is probably the most important thing you could do right here, is make sure this is all lined up. So we'll go ahead and pull this guy off. It's the yoke. So next order of business is to remove the center bearing from the front half of the rear dry shaft. So sometimes these slide off, sometimes you need a puller like I've used here. I'm gonna go ahead and loosen these bolts right here and see what happens. Okay, so it's becoming very clear to me that we're gonna need to use a puller on this. Things just aren't coming apart the way I'd like. So what I did is I just kind of made a mark here and marking all these brackets so that I can reorient it the correct way. So we'll go ahead and remove those just to get them out of our way. They do get reused in most cases. At least all the center bearings I've ever bought have only been the rubber piece. Okay, those are out of the way. Now this front dry shaft or forward section of the rear dry shaft will just pop out of the back of the transfer case. But as you might be able to see here, there's the exhaust right here. So we'll go ahead and cover that with a rag and put a drip pan underneath to catch any fluid that might come out. And we'll get this on the vise or on the bench, and we'll try to remove this bearing. Okay, as you can see here, I've got the dry shaft in the vise. One thing to note is do not clamp down on this dry shaft. This is just a steel tube, hollow. If you put any real pressure on it, you will crush this, and now the dry shaft's junk. I've just got it in here, just holding it in place, no real pressure. I could probably still spin it in here. But it's looking like I'm gonna have to use a puller. This piece just kind of fell off. And as you can see here, the rest of the rubber is just shot. So to help give my puller something to grab onto, I'm gonna rip this the rest of the way off and see if I can set a puller up on it. So typical with any project I start, things don't always go right, which, you know, that's reality. Had to use a bearing puller. This is how I have it oriented. As you can see here, sorry about the poor camera work. We've got the face of the bearing puller on the other side of this dust shield. So we're not pulling on that dust shield. You do not want to pull on that dust shield. So you got this nice and tight. We got a two-jaw puller here. I'm just gonna, put a wrench on that and tighten on this. Again, this dry shaft is not in this vise tight at all. You don't ever want to crush a dry shaft in a vise like this. I just have it here as a matter just to support it, make it easier for me to run this puller. So if this works, you'll see in the next clip that how this came off, I guess. Okay, again, I apologize for the poor camera work, but as you can see here, it's actually working quite easily. And just like that, the bearing's out. Okay, as you can see here, this is the bearing surface on the dry shaft. You'll want to clean this off, make sure you get all the debris off of it, dirt, clean it off real well. And then from there we can go ahead and I'll usually put a little bit of anti-seize on the surface here so that it doesn't seize that surface. Again, we're in Alaska, salt belt, so things tend to get corroded here. We'll prep this surface and we'll get the new bearing put up on here, and I'll show you how that goes on. Okay, so we have the new bearing here. What I've done is there's like a little grease seal right here. I just put a little bit of grease on it just to help keep that surface lubed up, and I put some anti-seize on the dry shaft surface that this bearing sits on. The factory Nissan part will usually have an F right here on the round part of this dry shaft bearing. As you can see, the other side has this weird kind of flat shape to it. So again, this side goes towards the front of the vehicle. Okay, I'm going to take a moment here to explain what I meant by phase alignment of the yokes. As you can see here, I've got my marks lined up. So I have a mark right here. Can't really see it. Sorry about that. Okay. That mark on the shaft is lined up with the mark on the yoke, and I've made additional marks here on the dry shaft itself. And as you can see, this is the transfer case side. This is the yoke you want to make sure you get timed with. So as you can see here, the U-joint will be in its vertical orientation in this case. This will be perfectly vertical as well. As you can see, the cross piece on this is lined up at the 12 o'clock position, and so is this. Now, if you were to goof this up and get it off like a notch, you know, off by that amount, you will induce severe drive shaft vibration, and you think that you broke it. So make sure, that's why I make the marks, make sure everything lines up properly before you assemble anything. The marks help a lot. Some guys are just able to line it up by eye, but if you're working underneath, sometimes you can't see the other end too well. So I like to make my marks easy enough, right? Okay, so next step. I've greased the splines here with just, normal moly grease. Put a little bit of anti-seize here. Put a little bit of moly grease on this surface here, which rides on right here. This lip here will ride on that surface, so you want to just have a little bit of grease on it. Okay, so next step, again, the round side goes towards the front. We'll go ahead and place this, oops, right here, like so. All right, we'll get that started. We'll put the yoke back on, get it lined up with its mark on the dry shaft here, and then we'll proceed with the next step. Okay, so I slid this on the dry shaft. I put the yoke in its place. I got the marks lined up. It's in its correct orientation in relation to the other side. We'll take a soft blow hammer and just hit the yoke here until everything seats. We may need to put the washer and the nut on, and we'll use a hand ratchet to tighten it down. until this is completely seated. It doesn't take a whole lot of pressure, so work slowly. Unfortunately, I don't have a camera person here today, so I'm just gonna go ahead and tap this until it won't move anymore, and perhaps use a washer and the nut here to get it to seat all the way in. Okay, we are tapped in. It did not take a whole lot of tapping, to be honest. If you tap here with a brass hammer or another softer faced hammer, you'll just get this all tapped in until it stops at the end of the splines here. You'll hear a change in sound as you tap and it seats. It'll become more solid sounding. Okay, so now the drive shaft bearing is back in place. It's nice and smooth in place. All we have to do now is torque down this, put the washer in and torque down the nut. Sometimes these have staked nuts. In this case, this nut was not staked. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put some blue Loctite on it. I could not find the torque spec for this anywhere. All Data Mitchell didn't list a torque spec for this, and I even looked up Nissan service info and they just mentioned to tighten it. So I'm just gonna take a ratchet and tighten that until it feels snug. Okay, I got the nut and the washer on, Loctite on the nut. Loctite on the nut and torque down to where it felt snug. Everything looks to be in good order. The drive shaft flange here is in line with the U-joint on the other side here, so we know that the drive shaft is in phase and will not vibrate. This bearing here feels good. Now we just need to take the drive shaft back to the truck. Okay, so we're back underneath the truck, and what we did is we slid the drive shaft back into the transfer case. Got everything aligned more or less how it was before we pulled the drive shaft out. So the next order of business is to put all the bracketry back together for the center support bearing. So we got this, we got the top loop, which goes around like so. So now we just need to get these 17 millimeter bolts through and aligned. And that does take a little bit of finesse here, but they have a nice little pointy tip which helps with getting things aligned. What I like to do is I like to pick it up like this, get the bolt through, and start it by hand like so. And then get my favorite ratchet and start tightening. But once we got things started, we have to remember that, we have to remember that we still need to get this rear half of the drive shaft up. So what I'll do now is I will unhook the drive shaft from its bungee cords that we hung it up with, and see if we can get this lined up. Perhaps we should have done this before we put the bolts in. All right, there's not enough give in the new rubber here to do this, so I'll just take the bolts out real quick. As you saw, it wasn't terribly difficult to get these lined up. But I'm not going to even edit this out because, you know, it makes it more realistic if we do it this way. So what we'll do here is we'll push the forward shaft forward until we can get the rear drive shaft, the rear half of the rear drive shaft lined up again. And then we'll work our bolts back through. Everything's kind of tight, but with the right tools, it's not terribly hard. this started. That's started. That doesn't feel right. So just finagle our way through. Eventually we'll get things to line up properly. And like I said, just gotta wiggle stuff until things start lining up better. Take your time. If it feels like you're cross-threading, stop. All right, I think that bolt started. That bolt still doesn't feel right, so we'll continue to wiggle it around until things just work better. And I'm underneath the truck, just again, so please excuse my heavy breathing. Alright, pretty sure that's in. That doesn't. So the important part is that the U-joint caps sit properly in the yoke here. So there's this little locating tab. You want the yoke to sit very nicely here on both sides. So from here, now that we got the dry shaft on, we can go ahead and put the little straps back in. Snug them down just a little bit. We're just going to do this to keep the dry shaft from potentially falling on our head. And we're pretty much close to done here. All right. I don't know if I should just keep the camera rolling while I do this, or maybe I'll do a little bit of video editing where we just fast forward through the wrenching. Something else I forgot to mention is that while I had the dry shafts out, I just checked the U-joints to see, make sure the U-joints are still nice and loose. I mean, not loose as in, got a lot of play, but the bearings were still spinning just fine. Personally, I like to keep the original U-joints in as long as possible. They seem to last longer than most of the aftermarket U-joints for some reason. Strangely enough, I could not find torque specs for anything in the rear driveline. All data, Mitchell, they don't seem to have any info here, and the Nissan data I saw was just said pretty much just tighten. I guess they expect you to know not to crank on, a tiny little bolt with an 8mm head on it. Or I'll do it now, what the heck. I'll double check it later. All right, so dry shaft strap, U-joint straps are on. We just need to get the center support bearing tightened back up. We'll use my favorite ratchet, the flex head. Again, I could not find the torque spec, so just use best judgment. Snug it up, just don't over tighten it. You saw how loose these were. I probably will go a little tighter than they were. I don't know if that Croil I sprayed on them helped loosen or not, but just use your best judgment. 17 mil head, snug her up. So we'll go ahead and remove the rag that we set on top of the exhaust here, right up here. See that? We only got a couple of drips out of the dry shaft. I think it's because the rear end of the truck is sticking up in the air, and that kept most of the fluid in the transfer case. But it's very advisable that once you get it sitting back on a level surface, that you double check the transfer case fluid, make sure that it's to its correct level, and add if necessary. So, as you see here, we are done. New dry shaft bearing is in. The rubber is intact. It's not anywhere near as loose as it was. Joint straps are tight. The bolts are tight. The center support bracket, bearing bracket bolts are tight. Everything seems to be looking good. All my marks are lined up on the other side here. Of course, you can't see it because I moved the camera to the other side of the truck for better access for me, so I'm not working around the camera so much. But anyway, that's how you get a center support bearing installed on a Nissan Frontier. This case, it's a 2000 Crew Cab 4x4. Anyway, I hope you like this video. Please click the like button if you liked it. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to be notified of any additional content that I post up on YouTube, click on the bell icon and select your preference for notifications. So, hope you guys are all having a good day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.